Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody who's out there. I want to welcome you to the greatest Haymarket book event in the history of Haymarket for Skyscraper Jails, the abolitionist fight against jail expansion in New York City. I say that on the real. This book completely has helped me think and write and analyze and work and practice in so many ways. My name is Dylan Rodríguez. I'm he, him pronouns. I'm a parent, teacher, scholar. I'm an organizer. I'm a collaborator, co-conspirator. I'm employed in the position of distinguished professor at the University of California, Riverside campus. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Black Study, in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies. More importantly, I am very proudly and humbly adjoined to multiple communities of abolitionists, serious, committed abolitionist practitioners, longtime and new communities of abolitionist practitioners who I know will be profoundly emboldened and sharpened and transformed by the analysis of this book. So let me ask the audience patience while I just explain what we're going to do today. We have about 90 minutes together. We're going to start with a conversation among the three of us, and I'm going to introduce our two co-authors in just a moment. I ask that folks who are taking time out of their busy evenings, days, and mornings to be here to please post as freely and as much as you want comments and questions on the YouTube comment section. And at some point in the second part or maybe the latter part of our conversation, we'll try to get to as many of those as we can with, apologies in advance for the fact that I'm sure we won't be able to get to everything in nearly as substantive a way as we'd like. With that, let me introduce our two co-authors. I'm really honored to be here with the two of you. Zhandarka Kurti is an assistant professor of criminal justice and criminology at Loyola University Chicago. She's the co-author of States of Incarceration, Rebellion, Reform, and the Future of America's Punishment System, and the editor of Treason to Whiteness is Loyalty to Humanity. Our other co-author, Jarrod Shanahan, is the author of Captives, How Rikers Island Took New York City Hostage, co-author of States of Incarceration, Rebellion, Reform, and America's Punishment System, and City Time on Being Sentenced to Rikers Island. He's also the editor of Treason to Whiteness is Loyalty to Humanity. He also lives in Chicago, works as an assistant professor of criminal justice at Governor State University in University Park, Illinois. Shout out Chicago. So let me kickstart us with a few prepared questions. And after that, I'm going to forego my MC facilitator role. We're just going to talk about whatever's on our minds. And I know there's going to be a lot. So can the two of you kickstart this discussion by just introducing the project, introducing the book, what brought you into it, what the stakes are of the study, especially as a critical contribution to abolitionist praxis?
You want to kick us off, Shauna?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, everyone. So good to be here this afternoon. Thank you, Dylan, for hanging out with us. Looking forward to a rich conversation. Want to say a big thank you to Haymarket for all of the work in terms of the book and helping us put it out there, and to the Abolitionist, and and the hope, the hope that folks will be reading this book and debating and engaging it. So, Jarrod is going to jump in, but Jarrod and I go back a few years. We've known each other for a few years. We met during Occupy, and we were involved in, Occupy, post-Occupy movement. So I would say Occupy and Black Lives Matter really brought us together. We were active in a lot of the organizations and organizing that came as of that. So we spend a lot of time thinking about a lot of the issues that the book addresses, namely, how do we as revolutionaries get involved in fights, in local fights in our communities, in our cities, and how do we, try to, steer it towards an anti-capitalist horizon. So we were, both active in a lot of the BLM struggles specifically, and we were really excited about the militancy, especially, from 2016 onward. So for the past couple of years, we've been really writing, reflecting on movements, analyzing it, and, sharing with folks in the hopes that we get together and we have these really important dialogues about the future of anti-capitalist movements.
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot to Haymarket for having us, to Dylan joining us, and to Zhanna for being such a great collaborator these years. I think it's very important that Jana mentioned the Occupy Wall Street and the 2014 kind of original wave of struggle that came out of Ferguson. Those were very important political events for us. And they also opened up this new era of American politics, defined by all kinds of experimental movement activity that centered around this figure of the refusal of a racialized class position. Now, if you were around during Occupy, you probably remember that we did a much better job articulating what we didn't want than what we did want, right? And I think that that's really characteristic of this whole movement that began around that time. That this moment that was opened by people who didn't have very much in common all over the world, saying, I don't know what I want, but I know that I don't want it, right? And coming together in these experiments and trying to figure out what kind of politics we actually do want to see. And when we're talking about New York and we're talking about criminalization and mass incarceration, which is the subject of this book, it's very important to keep in mind the refusal undertaken by two young African-American men, specifically Brown and Ferguson and Khalif Browder on Rikers Island in New York, both of whom refused their position in a system that was designed to subjugate and to force them into America's racialized hierarchy. And their refusals ultimately cost both of them their lives. They catalyzed large movements that really changed the political contours of the United States. And the final thing that I'll say is that we're going to be talking a lot about the nonprofit sector today and the kind of liberal, woke kind of nonprofit sector that's arisen in the last 10 or 12 years. And I think it's really important to emphasize that we wouldn't be having these conversations. There certainly wouldn't be billions of dollars flying around. People like me and Jana probably wouldn't have jobs now teaching about mass incarceration in higher ed institutions if it wasn't for these brave young people who stood up against the system that was to crush them.
Yeah, the two of you remind everyone that both in the book and in your opening comments, how the common fallback to phrases like carceral state, phrases like mass incarceration, similar kinds of criminological or criminologically inspired terms radically underestimate the conditions that people are confronting. Confronting, of course, in very different and asymmetric ways. But the conditions are, in plain language, the conditions of war, with all of the surrounding casualties and terror and demoralization, and for that matter, struggle and militancy and commitment and collective seriousness. And as Jarrod, as you put it, experimentation that necessarily come when you're confronting basically a one-sided warfare regime that, you know, liberal discourse encourages us to not recognize as war. So your opening comments are actually a great preface for my first question, which is, I'd like to get the two of you to think out loud in relation to the book about how the book itself and how your, I think, still ongoing real-time analysis of the Rikers Island struggle might introduce some new questions and some new complications to people who identify as serious abolitionist practitioners. In other words, Jarrod, to reference the last part of what you said, people who are not just copying the lexicon of abolition as part of, you know, this woke syndrome that liberalism and progressivism have brought forward, often, if not almost always, to the nonprofit apparatus. So I'm thinking about people who are serious, committed abolitionists, and for that matter, anti-capitalist practitioners. How does the study, meaning the book, how does the ongoing analysis of this struggle around the Rikers Island closure, which may not be a closure in the end, how does that introduce new questions and complications to abolitionists? You know, and I think building on that question is also whether you recognize any particular logics of reformism, reformist liberalism in particular, that might work in ways that force people to rethink their analysis and their strategies? So yeah, that's kind of compounded questions, but I know that it'll just kind of get you guys to think out loud and together about.
I feel like a necessary way to kick off the answer, which might take us the better part of our chat, is to give a brief synopsis for the viewers of what exactly this book is about. This is a story of how the widespread disgust and revulsion that people in all kinds of different social positions were feeling about mass incarceration and about Rikers Island was transformed from a demand to shut down Rikers Island into a demand to construct skyscraper jails all across New York City. And I think that that's really important because historically, and this is why I opened by talking about 2011 and 2014, right? Coming out of these really powerful mass movements, there was a lot of energy around reforming structural racism, systemic inequality. At the same time, Rikers Island, New York City, was becoming increasingly scandalous among even the city's kind of bourgeoisie. They didn't like bad press that was being generated. It's all in a racist hellhole, but it was particularly bad immediate years around Occupy, Black Lives Matter. And so we see in this moment how a widespread sense among people ranging from abolitionist activists, the families of people who've been locked up, all the way to prominent politicians, nonprofit executive directors. Everybody could basically agree something dramatic had done, including the closure of Rikers Island. And this is a story about how elite nonprofits are able to shape that campaign using millions of dollars and a very complex kind of organ apparatus. We're able to shape that demand to close Rikers and shape the campaign to close Rikers into a demand to build skyscraper jails. And it was a very effective propaganda campaign. Some of the design was kind of crowdsourced from formerly incarcerated people and activists from the New York City community, including Zhanna, participated in demonstrations that we really thought were about closing Rikers, and it ended up turning out that they were about building new jails. And so I go on, but Zhanna, would you like to hop on that?
Yeah. So first, I want to say that, thanks for the question. And so the Rikers story has all of these actors that I hope we'll get into, because I do think it gets at the heart of your question about liberalism, Dylan. But I think first and foremost, I want to say that a big part of the book and the scholarship that Jarrod and I have been doing in the past couple of years in reflecting about jails and the struggles against policing, jails, prisons, I think is trying to constantly bring in a materialist analysis to these questions, right? And I think, in that way, we are, building with abolitionists, right? As abolitionists ourselves are engaging with them on this question of, how do we think about the role of jails, policing, and prisons in our society, right? How is it that since the 70s, we've had this massive buildup where the state has essentially rolled back whatever welfare capacity and rolled out, a very punitive, literally stranglehold on working class folks, disproportionately Black and Latino folks, right? So I think what we always have done, and we try to do in this book, is to think about jails and prisons in this materialist way, right? When we think about Rikers Island, it's really important to think about jails as, I think jails more than any other carceral facility, right? It's really a symbol of the divided and double system of justice that exists in America, right? Any day, 80% of people that sit in America's jails are there because they cannot pay bail, right? That is insane to think about. So when we think about Rikers Island, we're talking about the most marginalized communities in New York City. We're talking about the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized, the working poor, but also the folks that, are participating in the informal economy, right, who are constantly being churned in and out of jail. And I think, when we did the book, we were very conscious to think about how liberals framed Rikers. So how liberal nonprofits and liberal politicians who wanted to reform and then were moved by movements to close it down. Well, it's still open. We're going to talk about that. But the way that they talked about Rikers was a moral stain on an otherwise great city. So I don't know where these liberals are going in New York City. New York is great for certain people. New York City is great if you got money, if you have a great job, and even that you're struggling to pay your rent, right? So I think we wanted to be really clear that New York is actually not that great for working class folks. That New York City, and in this way, this is not just a New York story, is a U.S. story, right? I mean, we are seeing Rikers Island and as policing and incarceration in New York City and all of these other short-term forms of punishment serve as a way to manage working class people who are increasingly thrown into poverty and can't really make ends meet because of all of the sort of social, political, economic changes that have happened in New York since the 70s. And here we really highlight that New York, we talk about neoliberalism. New York was the laboratory of neoliberal policy. Other than like Chile, right? Like New York was at one point known as the so-called Moscow on the Hudson, right? It was this place where the New Deal, sort of like these FDR-like policies that expanded pension, welfare rolls, right? So working class New York was had access to these things, right? And all of these things start to change in the 1970s. Ironically, right, and something we highlight in the book, as New York City's Black and Latino population is growing, right? So I just want to kind of like really emphasize that something that we really contribute to the abolitionist literature is to really see jails and prisons in these very materialist terms, right? Because we're talking about, we're not just talking about these carceral institutions outside of class struggle, right? They're really important in the ways in which our lives are organized, right? And how the state has managed poverty and has managed all of these transformations that have really borne down on and burdened working class people, right?
Which
Sorry,
brings us
I get hyped when I talk about New York.
Yeah.
No, this brings us to Dylan's question, which I think we can now try to answer. Because, something that we tried to emphasize was New York City has been an experimentation in austerity, in kind of law and order, warfare Keynesianism, as Ruth Gilmore says, since the 1970s. And I think what we saw among the nonprofit sector, the campaign to close Rikers, was a fairly remarkable development in the private sector governance of the public sector. Organizations like the Ford Foundation, which propped up a nonprofit, Just Leadership USA, with billions of dollars of money, took a very active role in orchestrating what appeared to be a kind of grassroots activist campaign. Just Leadership USA is a really interesting and cautionary case study in how nonprofits are evolving in tandem with social justice movements. The original president of Just Leadership USA was this guy named Glenn Martin. He's a formerly incarcerated African-American man. And the campaign, the slogan of the organization and the slogan of the Close Rikers campaign was, the people closest to the problem are the ones closest to the solution. Now, this is the kind of stuff that abolitionists, other radical activists have been saying for decades. And this is just one example of the way that the organizations in the orbit of those Rikers were able to absorb characteristics of abolitionist activism and other grassroots activism into a campaign that was funded with millions of dollars from big philanthropy, coordinated behind the scenes with kind of a veritable who of the New York City progressive elite, including judges, district attorneys, real estate speculators, and a kind of roll call of all the big progressive nonprofits. If you're a conspiracy nut, Soros was in there, but I don't think it's quite what you think it is. And I will say that this conspiracy is actually a lot more interesting than anything you'll see on InfoWars or whatever. And there's just as many moving parts, and it has the advantage of being true. But so this campaign actually had a lot of novel aspects to it. And one thing that I'll say very quickly is that we were able to find this organization called Katal, Katal, generated a kind of post-mortem of their participation in the Close Rikers campaign. And they describe in very straightforward prose how they were able to build this campaign up as a kind of grassroots seeming initiative. They got tons of organizations to sign on. Abolitionist organizations signed on around the demand to close Rikers. There might be a photograph somewhere of me and Jana marching, alongside these banners saying "Close Rikers," right? Who could dispute that? I got involved. I was recruited actually off the street when I was checking in with probation officer, and they said, "Oh, have you ever been to Rikers?" And I said, "Yeah, that sucks. Yeah, I'll close. Let's close it." And I rolled with the campaign for a little while before I figured out what they were up to. But they were able to build this grassroots kind of seeming campaign and build up a lot of media profile. They built up an organizing infrastructure. And then at a juncture, they revealed that they were not demanding the closure of Rikers, but they were also demanding the construction of all these new jails, and partnered with progressive architecture firms who used all this kind of social justice ideology to plan jails that were to be called justice hubs, places of care, and every buzzword that comes out of our side that you could possibly imagine. And by the time this was revealed, by the time the campaign came out, we're not just against Rikers, we're for the new jails. The abolitionists in the city had been successfully outmaneuvered to such an extent that it took more than a year to launch a substantive campaign against the jails.
Yeah, and just something quickly that I wanted to add, just to sort of to go back to what Jarrod is talking about. I think it's two main things that I want to add. Is like the first, I think there's oftentimes when it comes to abolitionist campaigns, especially when we talk about liberal reformers, counterinsurgency, there's almost this sense that we started the camp, abolitionists started stuff, and then all of a sudden the nonprofits took it and they like messed it up and they took us somewhere else where we didn't want to go, right? We wanted a more revolutionary horizon. They came with all their money. They hired, they threw money at the campaigns and they redirected it, right? And I think with the story of Rikers, Jarrod and I tried to complicate that a little bit, because the reality is that, and I think this is actually how struggles will unfold, in the coming years, and how they have been unfolding, is that we are entering a moment of deepening crisis. The fact that liberals were moved to even think about closing Rikers speaks to the crisis of legitimacy of governance in New York City, right? And in that moment, there were different actors that wanted different things, right? The liberals wanted to reform, close Rikers. I'm pretty sure their plan, all along was to build new jails, perhaps, right? Or, maybe not 4, maybe 2. I think there were the abolitionists who saw this moment as a moment to rethink what police and jails and the state investment in carceral institutions have done for New Yorkers, and to perhaps do something different, and to use that as a way to wage a larger struggle. So all I'm saying is that I don't think it's a simple story of just, abolitionists enter, nonprofits take it, and they run counterinsurgency on us. Actually, I think we are in this moment of opportunity, of deepening crisis. We're going to see all kinds of different social actors So I think the story becomes a little more complicated. And then the second thing I want to add is that uh, it's so disgusting how, to me and Jarrod, I mean, to anybody reading this book, how the liberal politicians and nonprofit use the figure of Khalif Browder. You know, in 2015, when Khalif Browder committed suicide, in June 2015, when he committed suicide in his mother's house, having been released from Rikers, having spent 3 years in Rikers, experiencing widespread violence, being locked up in solitary confinement, comes home, tries to get his life together to enroll at Bronx Community College. Um, does you know, and is going through a lot of emotional trauma, PTSD, commits suicide, unfortunately, in June 2015. So when Shutdown Rikers gets established as a way to remember Khalif and to use that as a way to say, hey, Rikers should close down now, it's so sick and twisted to see these liberal politicians and nonprofits literally take Khalif Browder's name to justify the closing of Rikers and the rebuilding of these 4 borough-based jails. And then so using the name and face of Khalif Browder, and secondly, lying to us with this crap about carceral humanism, the fact that these jails are going to have yoga studios downstairs, and better lighting, and I don't know, like IKEA furniture inside, right? Like this thing about prison reform now, that every prison is going to look like a Swedish prison, is like so out of touch with the realities of American life, the racial violence of class that is really at the heart of what it is to be an American. So I just kind of wanted to add those points too.
Yeah, I mean, what y'all bring up is a couple things. One thing that I wanted to, you know, use as another preface to the next to a question that I just thought about as I was listening to the two of you talk is, um, philanthropic foundations have kind of masterminded the art of of creating astroturf organizations. This whole concept of pop-up grassroots appearing, advocacy, activists, organizing collectives that usually have a fancy and seemingly credible name that actually are fairly predatory. Like they're predatory. They prey on earnest but oftentimes uninformed and sometimes gullible people who want to support so-called social justice causes. Um, this seems to be, a textbook example of that particular form of liberal counterinsurgency in action. And I think it's paradigmatic in the US and other parts of the world. And it's been the plan. Like the kind of instantaneous creation of astroturf organizations has been the plan for a long time. I mean, the Anti-Defamation League, in many ways, kind of forefronted this kind of political technology. But I wanted to get you to talk more about that, because one of the things that's going to jump out to people who read this book is how fun it is. How fun it is to read two people who are part of the struggle from day zero to now, um, naming names, identifying organizations, putting out justified accountability and throwing out the receipts about the constellation of forces that collaborated as an ideological political bloc to try to usurp and overwhelm the Rikers Island closure struggle and convert it into what effectively became jail legitimation and likely jail expansion. Again, another form, an advanced form in many ways, of liberal warfare against abolitionists, against ordinary people, extraordinary ordinary people seeking liberation and relief, from New York City policing and carceral warfare. Could you talk more and give the folks who have not read the book yet, a kind of a preview about that constellation of forces that got together to do that, to wage that particular form of ideological and political warfare against abolitionists and liberation seeking people?
Yeah, for sure. And Jared, feel free to jump in. I mean, I think, in New York, and I would say that this is very historical in New York as well, right? So what's interesting about the fight against Rikers Island and these constellation of forces is that these are not forces that like just dropped out of the sky, right? These are forces that have been growing and working with each other for a few decades now. Going back to kind of, I would say, the post-New Deal era in New York. It's just that they've gotten stronger. But for sure, the liberal politicians, right? Largely the Democratic Party, right? I mean, that is who the stronghold is in New York, in New York City. And then alongside them, these liberal nonprofits. And you're right, Dylan. I'm like, we do name a lot of names, and but I think that's part of it, right? I think Jarrod and I talk about it is that this is a book really meant for activists, right? Folks to really read it, to think about the history, the current moment, what happened, and how to move forward. But yeah, the constellation of forces was city council members, local politicians, mayors, right, who used the reforming or closing Rikers as a way to get electoral votes in this moment of crisis of legitimacy. But definitely the role of the nonprofit sector, I think, is really, really important. And it's something that we traced in other things as well, right? And I think the kind of the role of the nonprofits, and I know, Dylan, you talk a lot about this in your work, so we should definitely be all in conversation about this. I mean, something that I think we argue is that really BLM strengthened the political power and vision that these nonprofits could articulate, right? That BLM. So these nonprofits have always intervened in social movements, right? We go back to the Ford Foundation, and Black Power. But it was something about BLM sort of was that spark that reignited these nonprofits. And a lot of money was thrown at these nonprofits, to manage these social problems, uh, you know, and kind of steer them away from any potential revolutionary horizon, right? So, and there's a lot of money, and Jarrod, feel free to jump in. I mean, when we're talking about these campaigns, I think the difference is like, for viewers, right? Like, go to a protest, just like a regular protest, right? You'll see handmade signs, you see all these things. Like, go to a protest that's called by one of these large nonprofits, right? It's like really nice signs. There's a lot of money that is thrown at them. And I'm not gonna lie, a lot of people are also offered jobs, right? So there is there's all of these ways in which money is a big part of how folks and how these nonprofits become complicit. But I would say it's kind of this collision of the liberal politicians and the nonprofits, playing on, I would say, a lot of the divisions that exist within working class communities around policing, incarceration. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, they do it in this way that really prevents abolitionists from perhaps making better, stronger arguments. But yeah, Jarrod, feel free to jump in.
No, I think Jana did a good job of laying it out historically. I feel like, at the risk of belaboring the point, it's really important to understand that when we talk about the ruling class and when we talk about the state, we're not talking about singular actors. This is not like the Matrix or something. Like, there are different blocks of the ruling class, and there's different blocks of the state that have different strategies for how society ought to be managed and who get the resources in order to do it. I always think of that Marx line where he says, the crisis is permanent, the government only criminal, right? So in a capitalist society, there will be recurrent economic crisis, political crisis, legitimacy crisis. Now we have ecological crisis, right? It's not a harmonious way of living on the planet. And so there will be episodically these moments when large numbers of people are fed up, do not want to continue with the status quo, and are open to just about any alternative, as we see with the unfortunate rise of right-wing populism. And so when we talk about liberal nonprofits and foundations, we're talking about like a very particular social actor that intervenes in these moments. And it might be worth saying a little what foundations are and how they factor into this. foundations, relatively new. They go back to the late 19th, early 20th century. And they were originated effectively as tax shelters for extremely wealthy people to avoid paying taxes, mainly on the transmission of generational wealth. So you can set up a foundation, and that's tax exempt, but it's got your family name on it, and what it does, is what your family wants it to do. So there's like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, right? If you listen to NPR, you'll hear like a roll call of the who's who of all the lib foundations just about once an hour, right? And they originally, for the first couple decades of the 20th century, most of the foundations weren't terribly adventurous politically. There's a great book by this guy named Michael Barker called Under the Mask of Philanthropy that kind of tells this history. And there's also the Insight volume, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, that Dylan has a real essay in. But at a certain, around the onset of the civil rights movement and the urban unrest in the late 50s, early 60s, organizations like the Foundation began using their wealth to actively shape the unfolding of social crisis. So pumping money into, like Jean has said, pumping money into the side of the Black Power movement was not anti-capitalist. And Robert Allen talks about this. He got Ford's number very early. Black Awakening in Capitalist America, which I believe came out in 1990. He had Ford's number back then. So taking a role in actively shaping the unfolding of these crises by funding activists, progressives, right, whose aims are not antithetical to sustained capital accumulation, right? Capitalism is a very dynamic and revolutionary mode of production. I mean, there's some incredibly conservative people who are well, but the smart kind of globally modern transnational ruling class is actually very interested in innovation. And moments like the Ferguson Rebellion, moments like 2020 provide an open to shape society in ways that might be politically progressive, also ultimately geared toward maintaining the stranglehold that capital has on this planet. And what we saw in New York, to finally come around to what Dylan asked, was a microcosm of that. The City Hall convened an independent commission called the Lippman Commission, Lippman, after the chair, Jonathan Lippman, who was a kind of a famous reformer in New York City courts. And the Lippman Commission was composed of a variety of actors from the progressive criminal justice community, the nonprofit sector, these kind of woke nonprofits like Just Leadership and Catal, and politicians and representatives of New York City real estate, right? Because we're talking about like a $20 billion development deal. You can bet they're going to be involved in that. And I feel like, again, not to harp on this, but it's crazy that so many people are obsessed with reading the tea leaves of QAnon and all the rest of it, because all the biggest conspiracies are conducted right in broad daylight, right? You can read this stuff right on the Lippman Commission's website. You can look at the composition of the committee. It tells you so much about how a certain segment of New York City is organized. And I guess I would add to that in this ecosystem, there were some players who were kind of career professional managerial class people. So we're talking about career non-profit employees, whether it be the non-foot soldiers who are going out and getting signatures and signing people up, organizing and running meetings and acting formerly incarcerated people and bringing them to meetings and them to speak on behalf of this jail construction, right? There were also academics, like people like me and Jana, who, for whatever reason, became involved in these kind of community, so-called participatory action, which is something that I have a lot of critiques. These participatory action workshops around designing a better jail. And we have a chapter in this book, if you've ever encountered PAR, chapter 3, we have some real problems with how it was deployed. You get a bunch of formerly incarcerated people together and you ask them to design a better jail, and there's no option for no jails. It was a very simple exercise. And there's a strata of people from a professional managerial background who are effectively just kind of professional social justice technocrats and academics who are just putting this stuff on a resume. People change jobs all the time in the nonprofit sector. It's almost impossible to get a raise. They're abusive environments. You have to hear about self-care and all this stuff from your abusive boss, right? And so people are padding their resumes with participant projects like this and hopping all around the public and private sector. And so that's a little taste of the kind of ecosystem that existed over this campaign. But I would really encourage the viewers just to check out at least those chapters where we dissect the campaign, because it gives you a real glimpse into the kind of complexities of something that we could just say as, oh, AstroTurf campaign or that's AstroTurf demonstration. I mean, that's true, but all very complex operations.
Yeah, well, first of all, shout out to the late, great Robert Allen, who provided, I think, a real-time account of how this was happening in late 1960s into the publication of his book. I believe it was 1971, in Black Awakening Capitalist America. So I appreciate the shout out that you gave him, Jarrod. I want to get to this creepy shit that you were just talking about, which is, can you all say more about how this constellation of forces extracted people's life experiences and identities to authorize their liberal reformist counterinsurgency garbage? That's another thing that I have to tell you really jumped out, made the hair on my arm stand on end when I saw that happening. And part of it is because I have to confess, part of it is because I remember, it's not a confession. Part of it is I remember when this was happening in its early stages within abolitionist and proto-abolitionist collectives and organizations, and which you could loosely call a movement in the Bay Area in the mid-late 1990s. One of the architects of that particular extraction of experience and identity was Van Jones, who had his resume all the way to the Obama White House till he got his ass kicked out. And now he's like a CNN pundit, like fully ensconced in this liberal counterinsurgency, talking head punditry. Right. So, but could you all say more about how you saw that happening in the context of, I mean, it was happening in the context of a Rikers Island jail closure struggle. Right. And it's just so profoundly disturbing and disgusting, but yet in so many ways altogether predictable for people that have been paying attention over, any period of time about how these constellations they're shameless, they're aggressive. And I think, unfortunately, they can be very convincing in how they basically kidnap people. They kidnap our people. They kidnap our loved ones, our comrades, and turn them into their they platform them and they turn them into their figureheads and spokespeople. So could you say more?
I can kick it off just because I was one of those people for a very brief time. Sorry, Jana. So I was locked up on Rikers for a very short amount of time. It's nothing I really claim. But nonetheless, when the organizers with the Close Rikers campaign met me, they were really happy to find like a real Rikers guy. And I was told that I was a formerly incarcerated leader of the campaign. Now, first of all, I spent most of my time sitting on my bed, reading, doing push-ups. I didn't really do much that qualified me to lead a multi-million-dollar campaign. But thankfully, that's not actually what we were doing, right? So I would go to these meetings of the formerly incarcerated leaders, and there would be like these really managed kind of nonprofit settings, right? And if you've ever worked in these places or experienced one of these groups, you know what I'm talking about. There's as soon as butcher paper goes on the wall, you're already in trouble. But the butcher goes up on the wall. We're brainstorming, but there's somebody leading the meeting, and that person is not one of the formerly incarcerated leaders, right? That person is a paid staffer of this organization. And so in one meeting that we talk about the book, we were talking about where does power come from? And everyone was going around saying where they think power comes from. And I said, I think it comes, the concerted effort of the working class acting autonomously. I gave like this real hardline Marxist answer. It's like, okay, Jarrod, that's fine, right? And then at the end of it, the person who was conducting the meeting decided, well, the moral of the story is what we've decided is power comes from being politicians. Now, around this time, I looked at the person sitting next to me in the meeting who was a staffer with one of the nonprofits running this thing. And she had an agenda, the same as mine, except her agenda had the answers to the questions that we were asking. So this idea that power comes from lobbying politicians was something that had already been decided in advance prior to this deliberation by the formerly incarcerated leaders. And so I want to be really careful here, because I met some people who had done some real time, had their lives torn apart by mass incarceration, and who really just wanted to fix what was wrong with society. They wanted to right the wrongs of racism and incarceration and class violence. And what they found in the campaign was someone who was giving them a voice, listening to them, propping them up, encouraging them to speak, bringing them to me. Right? People, formerly incarcerated people I met, who I actually have a lot of respect for all of them that are involved in this campaign. Are smart. Some of them are very eloquent. Some have heard about abolitionism, and quite frankly, they just reject it, and that's on us. And I think one more thing that I'll say about this is that it was genius of these nonprofits to lean into this idea that we need to listen to the direct impacted people, because they had all kinds of resources to collect a whole lot of directly impacted people who agreed with them, right, and prop them up at these meetings. I mean, this is a delicate subject, but I feel like as a leftist, I feel like we were getting punished by this for tokenizing people. Like, this is what you get for tokenizing people. Like, they can do it too. Like, they can trot somebody out. Like, our enemies can trot somebody out who has had a terrible experience to give the line that they want to give, right? Just as well as we can. And it created these situations where a bunch of abolitionists who had not experienced incarceration were meeting, and they were arguing against this plan that was supported by people who had experienced incarceration. In my mind, the lesson that to was that experience is important, and we should let people who have had these experiences. No substitute for a political analysis. And we need to start taking it more seriously, that people with all kinds of experiences can come to the wrong political conclusion.
I just want to add real quickly to what Jarrod was saying is really important. I think, and I think this gets to one of the questions that's asked in the chat about, abolitionists do start struggles against jails and prisons, but when and how can we mobilize communities against us, right, versus how the state and the NGOs organize communities. So to kind of answer that question, I think it's really important to to recognize that when we're talking about New York City, also, we are talking about, and we're talking about Rikers Island, right? Like we're talking about predominantly Black and Latino New Yorkers, right? And I think the NGOs really, platformed voices, as Jarrod said, who oftentimes never get heard. Nobody listens to, Black and Latino working class New Yorkers, let alone folks who have gone to Rikers and who have done serious time, right? They are completely marginalized in the New York City life, right? They're marginalized in terms of the services they could access. So I think a lot of the nonprofits rely on formerly incarcerated people. And unfortunately, it's messed up too, right? Because they get used in these ways. They're not getting paid as much, right? They're getting paid like literally minimum wage jobs to launch these campaigns and to be part of these campaigns. And
I didn't get paid shit. None of the
Yeah.
formerly incarcerated leaders, quote unquote, that I was meeting with got paid fucking anything.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Donna.
I'm just thinking about even the landscape of nonprofits in New York and, re-entry, right? Like all of these areas that they do a lot of work in terms of reform, and I just remember going to, with some activists in the Bronx, we went to the Bronx hearing, right? This was one, the city council folks and the nonprofit, Jail USA, who was pushing for the new borough jail plan, was bringing largely Black men who had been formerly incarcerated in Rikers and who had also done serious time upstate New York, right? And I think it's not only the fact that they weaponized identity, right? I think they also were able to explain their vision in a way that made sense to New Yorkers, right? It was Rikers is so far away. You have to go on a bus to get there. It's terrible. Wouldn't it be better if we close Rikers and we make these jails closer to your home, right? Would it be nicer that, people who are going to jail could also go to the courthouse? And wouldn't it be nice that jails wouldn't be these terrible places, but they would be places where people could access social services, right? And when you're talking about New York and you're talking about working class and poor Black and Latino New Yorkers, you're talking about folks that are relying on social services, right? But now you're making incarceration and these carceral facilities the prerequisite to get that. You see what I mean? So I think why the nonprofits have been very successful is because they are reaffirming and they're sort of narrowing the vision of what is possible to New Yorkers, right? Whereas I think abolitionists, we are expanding that vision, right? But people are going to take action and they're going to do things depending on what they see as the horizon, right? So, growing up in the Bronx, and even when I was part of Take Back the Bronx, this was like a big thing that we were constantly up against, right? A lot of working class folks are not self-proclaimed abolitionists, right? That they're not necessarily, I want to do away with all jails and prisons. It doesn't mean that people, are not motivated by revolutionary politics or don't want something better than the hellscape that they live in. But I think people will only do what's presented in front of them, right? So I just want to be very clear about how these nonprofits, they are very good about putting forth their vision, right? And of course, it's a well-funded vision. So when we talk about abolitionists in this case, they entered the fray a little late, right? They entered in 2018, and it was more difficult to articulate the vision, right? And the abolitionist vision in this project and in this political campaign was really, really important, right? Because it said to the city, okay, we are with you. We want to close Rikers. We don't want to reform. Forget reform. Let's close Rikers. But why are we spending $10 billion to replace it with these borough-wide jails? Can we find something else to do with these $10 billion that doesn't involve these new facilities where people don't have to get locked up in order to access services? I mean, what in the backward kind of is that, right? Like you have to get arrested to get services. So I think that was really important, right? To put forth a different vision. But I just want to say how difficult, right? It is to, so how do you go from that is your demand? So now how do you operationalize it in the sense of how do you get masses of people to be behind you on that, right? And I think that's kind of the question of when we think about abolitionism, it's about what is the vision of society we're putting forth, right? And I think maybe this could get us a little bit even into, engaging with abolitionism. I think a lot of times it feels to people as if like it's talked about as a vision, as a dream, and the reality is that people are struggling, they're fighting, right? So we have to really talk about abolition as struggle, as a kind of revolutionary politics that gets masses of people together to be against something and towards for something else, right? So in this case, to be against Rikers and to be against these new jails, and to be for, housing, to be for the things that New Yorkers, working class New Yorkers need, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to add, right?
I mean, you're touching on a nerve of mine that's been exposed for quite a while now, and it's periodically led me to taking a momentary hiatus from identifying as an abolitionist in certain crowds of people, because the nonprofit industrial complex, in concert with the state, have been hijacking abolitionist terms, concepts, lexicons, and even some piecemeal practices for a number of years now, and they're doing it as we speak. Um, you see the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, universities, and even some district attorneys' offices uh, making full use of terms like restorative justice, transformative justice. Sometimes they'll even use the word abolition. They'll fund people who have a career path that is partly overtly abolitionist, as long as they perceive their practices as not actually engaging in a direct delegitimating confrontation with the state and with racial capital. So like, it's in their perception. Sometimes people can slip things by, but that hijacking's been happening. And so it raises a couple things for me. Um, One thing that I've found over the last almost 30 years is that one of the overcorrections that I think many of us abolitionists have made as political teachers, as organizers, as like people engaged with our surrounding communities and communities we get invited into, is I think we've had a tendency to do a version of what both of you were just talking about, in a way, which is, I think we overcorrected toward a notion of abolitionist praxis as primarily, if not entirely, about the work of addressing the needs of world making, creativity, building things, constructing things, etc., which is obviously central to the entire abolitionist tradition in terms of like diasporic Black liberation practice. That's what it is. We know this. However, the overcorrection was, I think we have failed to this point to appreciate how tapping into the abolitionist destructivity mandate, the destruction mandate, deeply resonates with people who are targeted by domestic warfare as much as anything related to immediate social service type needs. This is something I've seen over and over again So in other words, I'll be arguing with folks in communities I'm invited into who are like who start off with this kind of rejection of abolition by saying, nah, that's some like white college educated privileged bullshit. What we actually need are jobs, we need housing, we need food, etc. And I'm like, yeah. But what I'm also asking you is whether you're willing to understand that the reason why these are the questions and the vulnerabilities that people are confronting is because this is a state of war. And I'll tell you, almost always people are like, yeah, no shit, it's a state of war. Yeah. Right. And like, then we'll get into it. And then we will quickly tap into the destructivity mandate of the long abolitionist lineage. Right. But that's what it is that's getting curated out by that constellation that y'all just articulated so beautifully, right? That's the stuff that's getting curated out. It's getting curated and platformed out by way of this theft, this curating theft and hijacking of people's experiences and identities. Okay, so let me use that as my preface for another question that I think also addresses something that I think has been really central to the last 25 or so years of abolitionist work, and that's the concept of non-reformist reforms. Right. My teacher, colleague, comrade Ruthie Gilmore has really kind of popularized. among with critical resistance, other groups, like we've been talking about non-reformist reforms for a while. And we've tried to be rigorous about distinguishing between reformism and non-reformist reforms. I've been asking questions about this, and I'm wondering whether the two of you could help me and help those of us that are also asking questions. So the question is how does your collective analysis, your collective critical experience within this struggle, how does it possibly force us to rethink the place of or the place and or the stability, I don't know, the integrity of non-reformist reforms within abolitionist praxis, because they seem to be really slippery. And this block that you all are describing, which I would call a liberal counterinsurgency type block, it seems to constantly find ways to infiltrate and railroad non-reformist reforms, so they get pushed right back into legitimations of carceral warfare. So yeah, what do we do about this concept non-reformist reforms, given what y'all study and analyze in this book?
Yeah, I want to say I think this is really important, and I would just tell viewers and those folks who are either tuning in now or watching it later, really like the last chapter, I think is pretty good about engaging with that very question, Dylan. And I think so when we think about non-reformist reforms, right? One of the main ways we tend to think about it is like any kind of reforms are going to reduce the capacity of the state to be punitive, to build carceral institutions. So, I mean, I think one of the wildest, most dope form of non-reformist reform was the burning of the Minneapolis police precinct. I mean, that was, drawn to its logical conclusion, right? But then I think the question becomes, okay, and then what do we do, right? And I think so. Kind of in that last chapter, we started to we have this conversation about the fact that so first of all, fighting against the building of jails and prisons is a very much worthwhile struggle, right? That is something that abolitionists, folks should get involved in, right? And we wanted to talk about how that is, as one of the No New Jails activists aptly puts it, I mean, it's like really nice how she says it, it's also an entry point into struggle, right? And I think we need to think about jails and prisons as one part of the larger class struggle, right? That we really can't live in a world where jails and prisons don't exist and still have, like we can't have that and capitalism, right? So I think it's important to see that the struggle against jails and prisons is a struggle against the building of jails and prisons, is a struggle against austerity. It's a struggle against the capitalist state. It's a struggle for a different kind of society where perhaps we are not pressured and have to sell our labor to survive and to pay bills, and not criminalized for refusing to do that, right? So I think and I think in this way, as abolitionists, we could all agree on that, right? In that sense of that there is this relationship between policing, prisons, and capitalism, right? But how do we get there is the most important question. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do, is to really start that conversation and to start talking about Dylan, you mentioned, you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to qualify myself, identify as abolitionist. I think revolutionary abolitionism, right, is really important, because I think, again, it goes back to, yes, it is the struggle against jails and prisons, but it's also a struggle about the kind of world we want to live in. And this is, if we're going to get involved in this struggle, how are we going to connect it to all of these other struggles, right? So very quickly, and I know Jarrod has a lot to say. He looks like he's ready to say stuff. I just want to say, I think about the Columbia student, right, who was literally kidnapped by ICE. The graduate student who was kidnapped by ICE is sent to a facility in Louisiana. First of all, nobody knew where he was sent, and he was sent to Louisiana. And he's facing deportation. He has a pregnant wife, who's an American citizen, right? And I think Trump's plan of mass deportations, the fact of how he's using these really terrible racist immigration laws to target movements, right? To target pro-Palestinian movements, to literally deport anybody that was active in those movements. to get universities involved. I mean, I think these are really important connections that as revolutionaries, as leftists, we need to be making in this moment, right? So it shouldn't be just the struggle to close Rikers Island and these new jails. It should be now Rikers is being used to detain, immigrants that are facing deportation, right? So that's a moment of struggle. The new jail in Rikers is being built in the South Bronx, which is the poorest borough in New York, right? It's the last borough to be gentrified. And now is facing gentrification, right? Slowly but surely is there. All these high, condos are going up. So how can we link the fight to this new police precinct that just got built in the South Bronx, millions of dollars, to the fact that New Yorkers can't afford to stay in the Bronx? So what I'm saying is that the fight against the jails and policing and prisons really has to be linked to other aspects of working class life, like other aspects of the struggle that we all face. And I think that's kind of like our hope to really to kind of make that connection, right? And to put, like, what is the kind of vision, right, we want to put forward, and how can we bring these struggles together and, have people participate? Jarrod, yeah.
Let me just interject before I pass the mic back over to Jarrod. Shout out to all the work that people are putting in to support Mahmoud Khalil. Hopefully folks can use the chat right now and put some links up to find ways to just to back the struggle to protect him, to defend him against this. He's being taken hostage by the terroristic U.S. government. So Mahmoud Khalil, please, folks, jump in with support. And then I want to resonate with the notion that you just brought up, Jana, about revolutionary abolitionism, as well as I would just add insurrectionist abolitionism, which, what I mean? It's like under the rubric of an insurrectionist or revolutionary abolitionism that we can actually frame the burning down.
You fool, so you could say that. Like, do it.
Okay, no, yeah. No, I'm gonna say that.
That's literally, we call it. I think Jarrod, we have it in the book in the last chapter as the insurrectionary horizon. Right?
Yes, I love it. I love that part of that chapter because it's under that framework that we can think about something as audacious as people burning down a police precinct as a non-reformist reform.
Yeah.
Like under insurrectionist and revolutionary abolitionism, that is a non-reformist reform, and that's like, it's a relatively humble, it's a relatively minor act, right? As spectacular as it might be in the imagination, it's a relatively minor act that's a contribution. And the reason I think this is such an important distinction is because what really twisted my mind around in a bad way about 4 years ago was when I heard, a younger generation emerging activist involved with an organization of formerly incarcerated system impacted people arguing with a group of us from cops that were part of the Cops Off Campus movement, arguing against our position, our abolitionist position, by raising the terms that they had heard from some professor at UCLA. He was using the phrase incrementalist abolitionism. Right? Which is like the biggest contradiction of terms I think I've ever heard. I never thought I would hear a phrase like that, but that's the moment we are in, right? The moment we are in is where there's a fight over what the meaning of actual, revolutionary insurrectory terms are, where it's being domesticated back into incrementalism. That's the context that I think we are speaking to. Jarrod, take the mic back, please.
Oh, sure. Well, there was incrementalist abolitionism in the 1840s and 1850s, wanted to introduce all kinds of reforms to the institution of slavery, right? So it's not a new concept, but it's nothing that I would want to be on the side of historically. I think it's cool that you both mentioned the third precinct, because that's what immediately comes to mind for me. And Jana and I have another book, States of Incarceration, where we tried to unpack the kind of significance of the fact that in 2020, the carceral infrastructure was the primary target of a lot of the response to George's murder. And this is not easy to say, but I can think of a number of abolitionists who I've met in my life, people who call themselves abolitionists, who, if they were there when the third precinct was getting burned down, they would have tried to stop it. Abolition organizations, especially in the nonprofit sector, but individuals who, ascribe this kind of radical political orientation, but in their actual political lives practice a kind of technocratic liberalism. And this is especially true since abolitionism becomes chic in the nonprofit sector, in the publishing world, in the social media influencer world. It created this thing that I call live, laugh, love abolitionism, where, oh, the most abolitionist thing you can do is take a bubble bath. It's like, okay, I don't know what to do with it. And we're in this situation now where if somebody tells me they're an abolitionist, I actually don't know anything about them politically. And I've increasingly encountered people who say, I'm not an anarchist, I'm a communist, I'm an abolitionist. And when you really press, what's the meaning of this? What are you actually getting at? It's some kind of like Bernie politics mixed with the rhetoric of Black Lives Matter, anti-racism, decolonial movements. It's not a serious political orientation. And so I feel like Zhanna handled the material side of things, and you did as well, Dylan. So I can be an idealist here and for bad ideas. I feel like abolitionists like need to consider the possibility that their politics are not nearly as clear, articulated, or coherent as they might think. When you're a young person rolling with a lot of other young people who use the same phrases as you and who have the same reference points, really overestimate how much you know and how much you understand. So if you're in certain circles, the answer to every question is like some kind of bumper sticker. We keep us safe, or healing communities build better futures, or something like this. This kind of like AI generated jargon that's come to take the place of like serious critical analysis. And I feel like something that we offer at the end of the book is a series of discussion prompts specifically around the question of reformist reforms, which it's a novel innovation. It's important criteria, especially if you're getting your hands dirty in a real struggle. Things are never as pure as you want them to be, and you always have to make decisions that would be different from decisions like if this was like a video game or something. But we argue at the end of the book, non-reformist reform is one criteria by which to evaluate actions. And there's a whole lot of other possibilities that you can think about too. And something that we talk about is like we introduce a series of sample criteria. The book's designed study groups, in case you didn't know that. We say, what if we talked about the ability of a particular act, gesture, decision, build up the power of people to take action independently in the future, right? To my mind, that's as important as whether non-reformist reform or reform. I mean, how does what we're doing challenge the color line? How is what we're doing undercut machinations of the Democratic Party and the nonprofit sector, right? These are just some of the criteria that we introduced. We don't pretend to be exhaustive, but I feel like all abolitionists, including us, this is self-critique as well, may have fallen into patterns of thought that are a little bit too familiar and a little bit too comfortable. And it's really time, looking at how bad things are going socially, the rise of the far right, not just in the US, but really the lack of a coherent left alternative, and rising popularity of Trump, not just in these fabled white trailer parks, but also he's making important inroads in communities of color. I think all of this should combine to tell abolitionists that we don't know as much as we might think, right? And it's time to stop using these slogans and idioms and start like doing some real thinking.
Yeah, I'll say that I appreciate that thought, and I appreciate, Zhanna, what you said right before, Jarrod, because I think it is definitely a moment in which It's time for committed and serious militant liberation-oriented people, whether you call yourself abolitionists or not, to start taking serious collective inventory of whether and how they can start to engage in much more calculated risk, by way of radical experimentation, by way of properly distributed tactical and strategic and poetic and creative and rhetorical and ideological risk taking. I think we have no other choice, given the surrounding collapse that's been ongoing, which has reached a kind of crescendo. I don't think we have a choice. And Jean, I'm going to pass the mic over to you because I know you wanted to address one of the questions that the folks brought up in chat in our last several minutes here together.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And really great questions in the chat. Thank you guys for participating and engaging. So one of the questions that was asked about, the book discusses New York's approach to this carceral expansion. How does this reflect a broader trend and how cities in the US are approaching criminal justice reform? That's a really good question. And I think something that gets lost in a lot of the conversation about policing, mass incarceration is that it's not a New York story, it's not a Chicago story, it's not an urban city story, right? I think if we think about the growth of police unions, prisons, and Jarrod has done a lot of this in his also in his book Captives and the stuff that he's been writing about. When we see that, I mean, it's really a reflection of this deep capitalist crisis we've been in since the 1970s, right? And the growth of policing and prisons and jails has been a response to that, right? So it makes sense that it's not just New York City that's building carceral facilities, right? New York State undertook a really big prison building thing, right? In the 80s, right? They built all these prisons upstate New York, which is now under crisis, right? You have these correctional officers largely drawn from working class white communities in upstate New York who have really terrible lives, but they have this power and authority over largely Black and Latino prisoners, right? And they want more power to do what they want to do, right? To have more autonomy over. So I think in many ways, policing and incarceration, we really see the racial divide in America, right? The racial and class divides in America. That's one. And I would say that because it's been a response to this deepening capitalist crisis, we see these carceral constructions going up everywhere, not just urban cities. A really important phenomenon that I think we need to talk about and address if we're building movements, it's what's happening in rural counties throughout the United States and in suburbia, right? You have the really important work of Jack Norton, Judah Shett, right, who wrote that book, The Jail is Everywhere. And it is everywhere, right? Because America is this wasteland of deindustrialization, right? Where mass incarceration is also affecting, Native Americans, poor rural whites, right? Who are, being turned to jails and being incarcerated to deal with mental health and poverty. So those are all sites of struggle, I think, right? And some folks are doing work around that, right? Talking about and fighting those jail constructions when that happened. But I think if we take a revolutionary abolitionist vision to that, right, it's more about than just shutting down these jails and prisons, but it's using that as an entry point, as I mentioned, said, to this larger struggle, right? And I think that struggle is really against the forces of capitalism in this moment, right? The fact that the jobs that Trump talks about are going to come back, they're not going to come back, right? America has very much deindustrialized, and I think jails and prisons have been a response to that. So what does that mean for our movements, right? Like, what does that mean for the kind of campaigns that we build? What does that mean for the kinds of connections that we make, right, in this moment? But I would say that this is really about the US as a whole and just how the American state has handled all of the social problems that have emerged with the capitalist crisis in the 70s, right? That now are getting deeper and deeper.
Yeah, thanks, Shauna. I mean, as usual, you took the words right out of my mouth. I guess I would want to close, and you and Dylan have both hinted at this already. Something that we tried to emphasize in the book and try not to shy away and challenged ourselves to not shy away from in the book is the necessity for an insurrectionary revolutionary orientation. And I think that when I hear like people say that abolition doesn't make sense, I teach this stuff in a working class, majority minority state school in the suburbs of Chicago, in the south suburbs. And a lot of my students come from working class, Black, over-policed, industrialized communities. And when I see them, things like the writing from No New Jails in New York, which I'm very sympathetic to, they basically like, okay, middle class white guy, this is a thought, but this shit's never going to work in our communities, right? And I know it's a common experience that educators have, right? And we have discussions, but I feel like when people say that abolition doesn't make sense to them, we should take it seriously. And maybe actually the way that it's being posed in this kind of uncanny valley between revolution and reform, maybe it actually doesn't make sense. I mean, when you start thinking about, for instance, to take the hypothesis of Alex Vitale's End of Police book, Vitale seems to suggest that we can eliminate the police in the United States, keeping society pretty much the same, with the exception of some social democratic inventions that kind of remake the United States into some kind of quasi-Northern Indian social democracy, where by the way, they still have cops and lots of people get locked up, and abortion is a huge problem. So I just don't think that vision actually makes any sense. I don't think that you can talk about getting rid of cops, getting rid of prisons, without talking about getting rid of capitalism and the entire social order that rests on it. And so when people say that abolition doesn't make sense to them, I think we should take them very seriously on that point and start to be honest. Because I think something that I really don't like about a lot of the kind of abolitionist tradition that we've inherited is this kind of this Socratic exercise in telling people 25% of they think politically and slowly leading them through this wall of mirrors at the end of which they will decide they need to be revolutionary or something like that. I don't like that. Maybe I'm politically sophisticated enough, but I feel like be honest with people about what we think it's going to create a society without police and prisons. And it is nothing short of the end of capitalism, which to my mind can only be accomplished through insurrection. And believe it or not, that's how Skyscraper Jails concludes.
That's why I hug this book close to me. and so we're right at the end of time. I'm really sorry that we have to call it to a close for now. I urge everyone to get a copy of this book immediately, to integrate it into whatever courses you are engaged with, whether it's in a school, university or not, whatever study groups you are assembling or you're already part of. Your organizing praxis must incorporate study, collective debate, and thought and theory and analysis, and challenge into your collective work. I mean, this is something that this book contributes to so mightily. So I want to express my love and respect and gratitude to the two of you for putting the study together and also for just sustaining this fucking work. It's really emboldening.
Thank you so much, Dylan. It was great. It was great to be in conversation with you on this.
Yeah, for sure. And again, we just want to really emphasize that we would love for folks to organize like study groups, to engage. I think the last thing I want to say is we are in a very important political moment. I think a lot of people are tense, are anxious, right? Like people want to know, they want to do something, right? They may not know what to do. I think meeting each other, talking with each other, studying together, taking action together is great. The Democratic Party is not going to save us. They're over there sending emails asking for $5 donations. So I think this is a really important moment for revolutionary leftists, for us to engage with folks, to engage with all the new folks and to welcome them, right? into our spaces, and to ask questions and to engage together. And we really wrote this book as a way for activists to come together and to debate these things. So we really hope that that's how people use it.
And if you want to do a study group, have the money, send me an email. I'll send PDF. Sorry, not sorry, Haymarket, the movement book.
Yo, invite me into your study groups, people. I'm not hard to find. Invite me into your study groups. This is something we do. All right. Hey, thank you, Haymarket, even though we're trying to steal your books. Thank you, Haymarket, for platforming us today and platforming the conversation. What's up to everyone out there who's watching this live and who's watching it not live? Gratitude to you for being part of this, building community. Just say no to the Democratic Party. Just say no to incrementalist abolitionism, whether it's 1860 or 2025. And just say yes to Zhanna and Jarrod's work and their study in this incredible text that I embrace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peace,
Thank
everyone.
you.